Well, we're in a new sermon series here at Maitland Presbyterian based on the book Life Together, and that's by Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a famous theologian and pastor. And over the next few weeks, we'll be looking more and more about how God calls us in to be the community of Jesus Christ, and practically what that looks like as we live together as the church. So last Sunday, Pastor Dave talked about how we are called as the community to hold our tongue. And I'm willing to bet that spoke to just about all of us, because we know there are times that what we have said, the words that came out before we could pull them back in, got us into trouble and how it hurts us. But then this week, our passage from Bonhoeffer and then from Ephesians essentially says, yes, but. Yes, hold your tongue. Yes, hold back those words that come and rush out before we can grab them. But sometimes you will be called to speak the truth of Christ to someone else. Yes, hold your tongue before it gets you in trouble, but sometimes you are going to be led to speak to someone who's lost their way on the walk of faith. And while we know that this sounds good in theory, we have all seen speaking out go horribly wrong. When I was in college, I had an 8:30 a.m. class, which was so early. And I was walking across the courtyard, kind of half asleep one morning, and I see this man, and he's standing up on a planter in the courtyard. And he has this huge placard he's holding. And it says, "Are you going to heaven or to hell when you die?" And I kind of rubbed the sleep out of my eyes and kept walking, but he was not going to be stopped. He had a megaphone. And he found me in that courtyard, and he said, "You." I thought, oh no. He said, "You, where are you going?" And I said, "Calculus." But I don't think his words had quite the impact on me that he was hoping. Partly because I went to church, I knew the Lord, I knew that his strategy wasn't the grace that I have come to receive and understand in Jesus, but partly because he was a stranger. He had no relationship with me to try and speak any truth of the gospel into my life. So sometimes it's a stranger that gets it wrong when they try to speak the truth of Christ. Sometimes, and more painfully, it's our brothers and sisters right here in the church. Years ago, I had a friend, and I'll call her Sam. And Sam was a brand new Christian, just a little baby Christian. She had just accepted Jesus. She had been baptized in a lake, and she went to this huge community church. And Sam wanted to deepen in her faith, so she started going to a small group. I thought that was great. Now, Sam was also a single mom. She was raising an 8-year-old boy. She was scrapping as a waitress to try and make rent and to buy him clothes for school and just to keep life afloat. But Sam was committed to Jesus, and she went to that small group. But then one time after the small group, 3 women in the group pulled her aside. And they said, "Sam, the way that you dress is just not what Christ wants for you. That you're not living the walk of faith." Oh, she was devastated. Sam didn't have the money to go out and buy a new wardrobe to match her faith. What she had were the clothes that she wore to wait tables to keep food in her home. So we've all seen things like that happen when well-meaning Christians try and speak the truth that we know in the gospel. When Christians try and speak truth to each other, sometimes it breaks relationships, it breaks up groups, it can cause all sorts of problems. And yet, God gave us mouths to speak. And I think we think about that and start to think maybe God shouldn't have done that. But here we are with these mouths to speak. So what do we do? What do we do with that? Well, when we looked at Ephesians this morning, we're going to walk through it. It's just 3 important verses. Verse 14, We must no longer be children tossed to and fro and blown about by every wind of doctrine, by people's trickery, by their craftiness and deceitful scheming. Reminds us a little of the snake in the garden. Being in a community means that we have to develop a spiritual maturity to not get pushed around by the things around us. That means we have the maturity to not say the first thing that we think, or to speak based on that feeling that we're having, that anger or that jealousy. It means not getting pulled into the gossip and the slander and the words that happen in parking lots and after hours. That's childish. We are called to spiritual maturity. Verse 15, but speaking the truth in love. Speaking the truth in love. That's our verse. That's the one today that if you leave with anything today, speaking the truth in love. That's what we're called to do. But it's not our truth, not the things that we've come up with that are true. The verse goes on, we must grow up in every way into Him, who is the head, into Christ. So it's not speaking what we think is right. It has nothing to do with how old we are. We don't trust our own wisdom or the things that we've learned. It means as we grow up into Christ, as we get in the Word, as we come to church, as we come to know Him and grow in our faith, whether you're 10 or 110, that's spiritual maturity. And it's out of that we find the words that we're called to speak. Verse 16, from whom the whole body, joined and knit together in every ligament with which it is equipped, as each part is working properly. Now this means if we do this, if we speak the truth in love, that we as a community become one group, because we're all pointing to the same thing, and that's Jesus. We're not just individual talking heads with agendas and plans. We're one body, one group, working together. And it says, promotes the body's growth in building itself in love. Building itself in love. That's the goal, isn't it? To have a community here as a church rooted in Jesus Christ, building up in love, not by our efforts, but by the work of the Holy Spirit. So we then are called, in the book of Ephesians, to speak the truth in love to one another. Bonhoeffer calls this proclaiming. And for him, it's not just speaking any truth from the Bible, it's specifically to Christians that we see that have lost their way. Christians that we see that have lost their way. Now that sounds hard. Sounds a little judgmental. Sounds like the very kind of thing that can get us into trouble. So why say anything at all? Why not, if we see a brother or sister getting in trouble, why not just leave it alone? Well, Bonhoeffer says this, and this quote's not in your bulletin or on the screen. Most of them will be. This one's not, but it's very short. He says this, nothing can be more cruel. Nothing can be more cruel than the tenderness that consigns another to his sin. So in our best efforts to be kind, in our best efforts to not offend other people, we might actually be choosing to be cruel by seeing someone else drowning in their lives and not saying a word because we don't want to get ourselves in trouble. Now, both Ephesians and Bonhoeffer make it clear there's going to be a time when we are called to speak to one another in love, to speak the truth in love. So how do we know when to speak and when to hold our tongue? And when we do speak, how do we avoid causing harm and destruction and shame in someone else's life? How do we avoid coming across as it being about our goodness somehow? So first, we have to look at two things. We're going to look today at the origin of the words we're about to say and the intended outcome of them. The origin of what we're about to say and the intended outcome of them. So first, the origin of what we're about to say. If you look in your bulletin, and it might even be up on the screen in a minute, there's a quote from Bonhoeffer. Let's take a look. The speaking of that word to other people, is beset with infinite perils. If it is not accompanied by worthy listening, how can it be the right word for the other person? If it is contradicted by one's own lack of helpfulness, how can it be a convincing and sincere word? If it issues not from a spirit of bearing or forbearing, but impatience and the desire to force its acceptance, how can it be the liberating and healing word? Bonhoeffer is saying, in other words, if it's not based in our love for Jesus and our love for that other person, how can it be helpful to them? What is the origin of what you're about to say? Is it your dislike of that person? Your anger or jealousy or frustration with them? Is it intended the outcome to point to your superiority or the way your life is on track? If the answer to any of those questions is yes, hold your tongue. Stop right there. If it's about you or making yourself look good, or if it comes out of your feelings, don't do it. That's not what God calls us to do. But sometimes you're going to see a brother or sister struggling, and your heart is going to break for them. You're going to be overcome with love for them as you watch them struggle and fall away. You'll feel words sort of bubble up from the Holy Spirit in you as you pray and wrestle and think about the situation that they're in. The origin of those words is love. And in those cases, we're called to speak the truth in love to one another. And if we do that, if we discern and wrestle and pray, and we're sure it comes out of love, the outcome will be pointing them to Jesus. The outcome of that time with them, even if it's hard, will be pointing the way back to Christ. Because if we're a community that speaks the truth in love, we love one another too much to stay silent. The other Bonhoeffer quote in your bulletin, he says it like this: when Christians live together, the time must inevitably come when in some crisis, one person will have to speak God's will to the other. We speak to one another on the basis, hear this part, on the basis of the help we both need. We admonish one another to go the way that Christ bids us to go. We warn one another against the disobedience that is our common destruction. We are gentle and we are severe with one another, for we know both God's kindness and God's severity. We speak out of love for one another to point others to Jesus, not because we're better at it, not because we're a good Christian and they're a bad Christian. We speak because we both need that truth in our lives. When we're pointing others to Jesus, we're doing it as much as a reminder to ourselves as we are for them, because we are all saved by the grace of Jesus Christ. All right, so how do we start? We know then that you are called to speak the truth in love to one another, in your life and in your relationships and here in the church, and that you do it as much out of your own need for that grace as for theirs. So where do you start? You start in prayer. Before you ever speak, stop and pray. Pray, God, am I saying this out of my love for that other person? And am I saying it to point them to you? And if the answer to those questions is yes, then ask the Spirit to give you the words to say. And then if you feel so led, have the courage to speak. You might be the only one in that person's life who can speak to them about Jesus. You might be the only one that has the relationship with them. who knows their pain and their struggles and what they're wrestling with. You might be the only one that is a believer in Jesus Christ and can hold on to them with one hand and on to Jesus with the other. So you might be the only one with the relationship to speak. And this can look a lot of different ways, but I think a really powerful time that we speak that truth to people is when you see that someone is struggling because something in their life has taken the place of God for them. Maybe they're having an affair. Maybe they're caught in addiction to alcohol or drugs. Maybe they've simply gotten so busy that they've lost sight of their faith. And it can start with one sentence. Maybe you're in a small group, and there's a man in your small group, and he's talking, and he says that he and his wife they're moving forward in their jobs and in their family life, but they just haven't connected in a really long time. And he's worried he's losing his marriage. But then he stops and he says, but we're just too busy. We just don't have time to deal with it. Speaking the truth in love might be you saying to that person, one sentence, it's time to invest in your marriage. It can be that simple. Maybe you run into a woman from church when you're out and about town, and she says, I'm really struggling in my faith. I've been too busy to come to church. I'm too busy to read the Bible. I'm too busy to pray. But, isn't that all of us? It might be one sentence saying, you need to go to church. We miss you in worship. Speaking the truth in love might mean walking with a friend who's been drinking too much, and you've watched his family life slip away, and he's not interested in the same things anymore. And speaking the truth in love could be as simple as saying, you should get to an AA meeting today. I'll go with you. Or maybe you have a sister and she is exhausted because she's running from one place to another and trying to be perfect all the time. And at the end of the day, she just feels like she never measures up. Speak the truth in love. To say, you are loved by God just as you are. You have nothing to prove. Speaking the truth in love comes out of our love for Jesus and our love for one another to point others back to Him. And if we can do that, our community can be transformed by God, one day at a time. I worked with a small group a few years back, and they met together every Wednesday night. And over time, they really did develop a real working knowledge of each other's lives and relationships. They hung out socially, too, on the weekends. They were starting to really become like a family. But one day I was in my office, and 3 members of the group showed up at my door. And they just looked so worried. And they said, one of the men in our group has been drinking a lot. He's been drinking too much on the weekends, and we're worried about him. We don't want to say the wrong thing, and we don't want to hurt him, and we don't know what to do. And we talked for a while, and they decided that they would talk to him. Not because they felt like their lives were any more put together, but because they loved him so much, and they were dying watching him struggle. So they went and met with him, and it was hard, and it was uncomfortable, and they felt awkward. But because they spoke the truth in love for him, their relationship didn't break, and in fact, it got stronger from there. And then just a few weeks later, a woman in the group was struggling. She was in a bad relationship, and it was hurtful for her and for her friendships and for her health. And this time, a woman in the group who kind of knew what had happened with the guy said, I think I'm supposed to talk to her. So she went and met with the woman and spoke the truth in love to her about God's best for her in her relationships and her dating choices. And I was overwhelmed and surprised watching that group because they became the body of Christ to one another. They started to say things like, this is the one place where I can be honest about my life. They would say things Like Wednesday night is the one thing that gets me through the rest of my week and anchors me in faith. And they were able to do all of that by starting by speaking the truth to one another. Ephesians told us that speaking the truth in love, we grow up in every way into Him who is the head, into Christ. May it be so with each of us, and may it be so with our church.